My name is Ben Poulter, and I've started a podcast called Toolbox Talk for Electricians. My main problem for growing my podcast was I think that the direction. Basically, I was doing everything that I assumed that I should do without actual evidence of something that works that I knew I should do. Well, when I first started, I've been doing my podcast for 2 years. Ideas on how to grow the podcast, to do it myself, to think, right, yep, I can do this, write it all down, getting notes. But then having someone that maybe specializes is sort of, again, like niching down, someone to help you grow your podcast that knows the specific steps to take for a podcast to grow, not a YouTube channel, not a social media presence, not a TikTok, for a podcast to grow. I don't like giving up. So I carried on. I carried on trying and trying. But then the thing is that with when you're doing any sort of project, if you don't see progress, it gets disheartening. So when you finally start seeing maybe a little bit of progress and then a lot of progress, and you think, hang a frigging about, it's getting a bit out of control, but then it's all right because getting more listeners have got you back there as well, and then give you more ideas and handle that control, which you didn't really think you'd get to that position, to be honest with you. It's comforting in a way, knowing that you've got someone to ask to say, yeah, okay, look, I've got to hear now. What do you recommend I do? And when someone comes along and says, well, yeah, we've seen this 10 times before, do this, this, this. You're like, great, I don't have to make mistakes in a way. You can know where you're going and what you're doing. So that worked out fantastically for me. And I can ask questions and I can get answers, and we can obviously share screens and go through the problems to work them out together. I realized myself that it was working a lot more before I got actual physical knowledge that everyone was listening to the podcast, because you could see how it would work. You could see why you're doing SEO. You can see why you're structuring the titles to capture the attention. You can see why you're doing the description on the show notes. So you want to make sure they listen. This is the thing. And you can see why you do things, every little step that you sort of do that aims towards growing the podcast, rather than just putting it out there and sort of whack and wishing in a way.
Ben spent 2 years trying to grow his podcast, posting constantly on social media every single way he could, inviting high profile guests onto his podcast. And despite all the time, effort, and energy, 2 years later, he was left with a podcast that was stuck with slow and steady growth. No matter what he did, he couldn't break past 400 monthly downloads. But what if I told you that after making a few simple changes to his approach, we relaunched a new show and he went from 0 to over 5,000 monthly downloads in just 90 days. And we did this without him relying on social media promotions, high profile guests, or word of mouth. So look, if you're an entrepreneur or expert who wants to grow a podcast that builds your personal brand and attracts dream clients to your business, but are currently stuck with slow and steady growth, unable to break past whatever current plateau you're at, this video is going to show you the exact steps you can take in order to fix that right now. So look, my name is Anthony Winery. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListeners.com, a company helping entrepreneurs and experts grow a profitable podcast that builds their personal brand and attracts dream clients to their business. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, published multiple best-selling books under the pen name of Daniel Larson. Don't ask why, long story. And I'm the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which generated $120,000 of additional profits for our online coaching business, and now help other entrepreneurs and experts do the exact same with their shows. So with that being said, let's dive straight in. Here's how Ben went from strong to growing, to relaunch a new show, to go from 0 to 5,416 monthly downloads in just 90 days, without social media, high profile guests, or even word of mouth, and how you can do the exact same. So look, let's rewind a little bit. And I want to make something very clear. Ben was not lazy. Ben wasn't inconsistent. And in fact, Ben did absolutely everything he was told to do by Podcast Guru, or when he searched up on the internet on Google of how to grow a podcast. He invited high-profile guests onto a show in hopes that they would bring in a new audience. He created short-form clips in order to build exposure and awareness around his podcast. He posted on TikTok and different reels and all of these different platforms, trying to be everywhere. And he talked about escaping the 9 to 5, which, to be honest with you, everyone talks about that. So I guess there's something to be said there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Yet, no matter how hard he worked, he was still stuck at 400 monthly downloads. And this is where most podcasters hit a wall, right? They launch a show, they build some traction, but eventually they hit kind of a plateau, this kind of stage where they can't break past. For Ben, it was 400 monthly downloads. For other podcasters, that's 3,000, 4,000 monthly downloads. For you, it might be 20,000. It could be different for everyone, but eventually you kind of hit this glass ceiling. And here's a truth that no one tells you. Great content alone isn't enough to grow your podcast. Posting everywhere on social media doesn't automatically guarantee you're going to grow your show and bring in new listeners. Having big name guests on your podcast doesn't mean their audience will care and actually come and become a listener of your show. And Ben wasn't failing because of effort. And likelihood is if you're podcasting right now and you feel like you've hit a plateau, you probably are being consistent. You probably are doing all these different things that you've heard to do. The reason why Ben was failing and the reason why so many podcasts kind of hit this plateau is because they don't really have a real podcast growth strategy in place. He was just throwing spaghetti at the wall or throwing crap at the wall essentially, hoping that something would stick. And let me ask you this, do you feel like you're sometimes doing the same thing, kind of just hoping and guessing that eventually the podcast will take off? If so, keep watching, because I'm about to break down 3 things every podcast needs to quickly grow and why most podcasters go wrong. There's really 3 key things we need in order for a show to grow. And this is really the starting point for Ben as well. The first is we need more exposure. So we need more people discovering your podcast, finding out about what you're doing. It's turning that exposure into casual listeners. When someone sees your podcast, they have to decide to listen for the first time. How do we turn that exposure, someone viewing your podcast, into them clicking play, listening to your content? And then finally, keeping those listeners coming back for more. And those are the 3 things every podcast needs in order to grow. If you can't get exposure for your podcast won't grow. If you can't turn that exposure into listenership, no one's going to listen to your podcast. And if you can't get those listeners coming back for more, it's impossible to grow your show month after month after month if, again, you can't keep those listeners coming back for more. Now, most podcasters only focus on getting exposure, hoping that exposure alone is going to be the thing that drives massive growth for their podcast, but it rarely does. And here's why. Imagine for just a moment, you're trying to fill up a bucket with water. Now, there's a bunch of holes everywhere in the side of the bucket. No matter how much water you pour in, it just leaks out. And that is exactly what's happening when podcasters are trying to drive massive traffic and exposure to their show when their podcast isn't optimized and isn't built to retain listeners. There's no system in place to keep those listeners coming back for more once they're in and have listened to one particular episode. You have to fix the leaks first and then pour in more water. That's the only way in order to fill up the bucket straight to the top. Now, you might be thinking, well, I'm at 2,000 monthly downloads and I'm stuck there. Or I'm at 400 or I'm at 1,000 monthly downloads. Therefore, my podcast is keeping people come back for more. I just need more of the right listeners. Well, no, because what's actually happening is we have a situation where new listeners discover your podcast, listen to it, but then they're not sold an entire back catalog and then they leave. And then you have more new listeners coming. They listen to an episode, they love it, and then they leave again. So it's almost like you have this filtration system where new listeners are coming in, but old listeners are leaving. So you kind of stabilize at this point of 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, whatever download mark or ceiling you hit. That means, again, there's a retention issue, not an exposure problem. Now, Ben was making the exact same mistake with his show that so many other podcasts make. Everyone, like I mentioned, obsesses over exposure. But what happens, right, when you put a bunch of new listeners into your podcast that isn't built to retain them? And if your podcast is stagnant, this is a clear sign that you're suffering, it sounds so dramatic, right? Suffering with leaky bucket syndrome. Essentially, people come in, people leave. And that's why for Ben, we didn't decide to focus on exposure to begin with. That wasn't the main starting point for us. For us, we started with turning exposure into listenership, so getting strangers to click play for the first time, then keeping those listeners coming back for more, retaining those listeners so they're actually binging the content. And then finally, we then went on to getting more exposure for a show once we knew the podcast was proven to turn strangers into listeners and proven to keep those listeners coming back for more. So again, it's a slightly backwards, but it's important to have this frame of mind. So here's what a checkpoint looks like. Number 1, we needed to position him as an authority. Number 2, we needed to create a content strategy to keep those listeners coming back for more. Number 3, we needed to optimize this podcast for podcast SEO, which in just a moment later on in this video, I'm going to break down exactly what that is. And this really is something that most podcasters miss that screws them up when it comes to faster organic growth. And then finally, building an online community where he could interact with his listeners, starting with number 1. Authority positioning. This really is the foundation of growth that most podcasters completely ignore, and you literally can't afford to ignore. I'm going to break down exactly why. So this was Ben's original show. It was called Breaking the Chains of 9 to 5. Now, it sounds inspiring. It sounds great. The cover art is semi-questionable, to be honest with you. But for the most part, Breaking the Chains of 9 to 5 is not a bad show name, or, it doesn't sound terrible, right? But why didn't it work? So let's break this down. It doesn't clearly define who it's speaking to. Again, it doesn't make a promise that speaks to a specific pain point of the audience he wants to attract. And it sounds like thousands of others quit your 9 to 5 podcast. There's a bunch of generic business shows out there. So when you have a show that's a break your change from 9 to 5, in a very crowded market, it's very hard for you to stand out. Why would someone listen to your show when it's super generic versus Tony Robbins or Stephen Bartlett? Generic shows don't stand out, they don't cut through the noise, and they definitely don't attract the listeners you want. And the reason this happens is because most of the time, for Ben, he wasn't really clear in terms of who he should serve with his podcast. He just made a podcast because he wanted to, and thought it would be great for his network, and great to help him build his personal brand, but didn't really have a clear direction. And this is what we see with so many podcasters who we end up working with within our Get More Listeners Academy, right? They create a broad podcast for everyone, and then they end up attracting no one to their show. Now, this is a problem. If you have a broad podcast that doesn't target a specific listener, you're going to have some issues. If you want to build a personal brand through your show that, again, attracts dream clients to your podcast, you can't be broad. You need to be targeted on specifically who you want to listen to your show. And the truth is, people don't listen to podcasts for motivation, right? If you're a business owner, the main goal is to present your podcast as a solution to your potential clients' problems. Then when they see your podcast, they can self-qualify, say, hey, this podcast is for me. I love it. I'm interested. I want to learn more. They listen to an episode, they binge the content, they then build a like, know, and trust, and they become a client. That's the flow if you're a business owner, an entrepreneur, an expert who wants to, again, use the podcast to build their personal brand and attract dream clients to their business. For Ben, he didn't really have that. So this was the first major shift we needed to make. We needed to clarify specifically who his show was for. So instead of us speaking to everyone, we repositioned his podcast to only speak to electricians. This way, we were clear on exactly who we wanted to reach. That meant that his marketing, when he was promoting on social media, was way more targeted. He was speaking to an electrician. And for context, right, we decided to go with electricians because after doing a bit of digging for Ben in terms of who is he best equipped to serve, we identified that while Ben went through a transition of working on his 9 to 5, and then he transitioned to be a self-employed electrician and scaled his business up to above 6 figures. This was a desired outcome that a lot of electricians who aren't self-employed would love, but they didn't have the direction in terms of how do I go from being employed to self-employed? What does that look like, right? So for him, that was a really unique value prop that he had. So he targeted that. For you, ask yourself, what problem am I best equipped to serve for my audience? What transformation have I gone through that I believe other people want to go through? For some people, they overcome anxiety. For me, we help podcasters grow. For other clients that we have, they've worked their way up to an executive role, and now their podcast teaches other people who are in corporate how to ascend up the corporate ladder. For you, what does that mean for you? What transformation have you gone through, and what problem are you best equipped to solve for a specific audience? And then once you know exactly who that audience was for Ben, again, electricians, it was now about how to present the podcast in an absolute best way. How do we cover this up, make this look beautiful, and make it wildly attractive while we're speaking directly to them, to that avatar we're trying to reach. That calls them out, that makes them feel like the show is perfectly made for them. Again, we have to present the podcast and communicate who the show is for in that way, which meant changing his show name, right? His actual podcast name from Break the Chains to the 9 to 5 to something that was way more specific, calling out electricians. For you, it would be something different. When it comes to changing your show name, it's a massive signal that you're able to use to call out and position your show as a right thing for your listeners. So his new title then became Toolbox Talks for Electricians, Reduce Stress, Gain Back Time, Make More Money. We then designed a new professional podcast cover art focused on the brand, not just his face, right? Because before it was him, some chains, it looked cool, but I wasn't really calling out anyone. It was less about the brand and what he's trying to achieve and more about like him and himself. Now, for a second, just imagine you're an electrician, okay? And you're super stressed out, you're overwhelmed, and you want to make more money. And then you see this podcast pop up in your feed, whether that's social media or whether that's your streaming platform on Apple and Spotify. You see this cover, Toolbox Talks for Electricians, and there's actually a subtitle, which is Reduce Stress, Save Time, Make More Money. Would you click, right? Would you be interested compared to if you saw a promotion talking about the generic Quit Your 9 to 5 podcast? It's a massive difference in his ability to position himself as an authority, in your ability to position yourself as an authority, to turn more strangers into listeners, to convert exposure into actual listenership. So now instead of him competing against a sea of generic business podcasts, Ben owned his niche, right? His podcast became the obvious choice for his ideal listeners. That one shift meant we were now turning way more strangers into first-time listeners. But of course, getting people to click play for the first time is just one half of the battle. The second half is actually keeping them coming back for more. So this is where the second piece comes in, right? building a demand-based content strategy. And not having this is the reason why so many podcasters bleed listeners. Again, sounds super dramatic, but that's the honest case, right? People are coming in and leaving. It kind of sucks because, again, you're putting out good content, but if you don't have the right content strategy, you're not really maximizing the growth you could have with your show. Because see, most podcasters think that growth just comes from getting more listeners. But the real growth lever really is about retention. How many listeners can keep coming back for more? That's where the exponential growth starts to happen. Now, here's where most podcasts fail when it comes to their content strategy. They talk about way too many topics. Their episodes are random and they don't build on each other. They invite high-profile guests on, and the high-profile guest dictates the direction of the conversation. And you might have a topic, but you don't know what the guest is going to say. And they didn't have a clear reason why listeners should subscribe and keep coming back for more, why listeners should binge the entire back catalog. And again, that's exactly what Ben was struggling with. He was covering, with his old show, random business topic that was super generic, instead of solving very specific pain points for his audience. So the solution was pretty simple: to build what we call, again, a demand-based content strategy, which is a clear content strategy based on your audience's pain points, based on demand of what your audience are looking to actually listen to. We didn't just guess what topics to cover, we did deep research. We had to find out, hey, look, what are the main pain points of this audience? How do we make sure that when we're covering specific episodes, each episode is highly targeted and highly relevant based on the audience he's trying to reach? We found out that it was actually stress and burnout. It was time management and efficiency for electricians. And it was, how do we make more money without working longer hours? And now, because we know these three key pain points of this audience, every single episode from that moment on had to fit within these buckets. They had to talk about each one of these things. That is how you keep your listeners coming back for more, because every single episode feels like the solution that they're looking for. And the result was this, right? More listeners started subscribing because they knew every episode was built with them in mind. Each episode was solving their biggest struggles and their biggest problems. The podcast became their go-to resource and not just another generic podcast out there that doesn't really solve any solution, but has random topics covered, but not highly targeted and relevant to a particular person. And that's exactly what we built for Ben's podcast. Now, not having these pieces in place is what keeps so many awesome podcasts stuck with slow growth. You can't grow a show if you can't keep listeners coming back for more. So awesome. Now we're in a spot where we're turning more strangers into listeners with our authority positioning, and we've got them coming back for more with a targeted demand-based content strategy. But of course, there's still one more problem, right? If people can't find you, they can't listen to it. So the next step really is about getting discovered. How do we make sure we're now reaching on a consistent basis, predictably, more listeners who the podcast will be perfect for? And that's where the third point comes in, which is podcast SEO, which really is the hidden growth lever most podcasters totally ignore. Because here's the thing, right? The main strategy that most podcasters use to try and grow is essentially social media, which is promoting everywhere, promotional clips, whatever that looks like, right? But the issue is when you promote on social media, well, number one, only a percentage of your audience on social media might actually resonate with your show. Number two, the platforms aren't actually optimized to get people taking action and leaving the platforms. So if you're making all these posts online, like, people aren't incentivized to leave the platform because they're on the platform to have a quick dopamine hit, to watch some cat videos, to maybe like some posts, but they're not on the platform to discover a new show to listen to. So no matter how good your promotion is, you won't convert the highest percentage of people because, again, they're not in that state of mind where they're looking for a new podcast to listen to. And even when you share a promotional clip, people love your promotional clips, they gain value from the promotional clip, but it doesn't mean they're going to invest the next 60 minutes into a long podcast episode. It just doesn't happen. And if you've been posting on social media for a while now, trying to promote your podcast, the simple question is it working? You know, like, is that actually working? And more times than not, it doesn't help you grow. So that's one way. And then the other way is relying on high-profile guests. But again, the issue with high-profile guests is the fact that even if you get someone, let's say, millions of followers or an industry leader within your podcast, let's say, to come onto your podcast, let's say, oftentimes, you know, the hope is that they promote the podcast to their audience, and then their audience will come to your show, listen to the podcast, and then become a listener. But there's a couple of reasons why this doesn't work, right? The first is, which is frustrating, the guests, they don't promote your podcast, right? And let's say, or magically, somehow they went all out and promoted their show. Oftentimes, a lot of their audience, or less of their audience than what you expected, go ahead and take action and listen to the podcast episode. Even when they do promote and the episode, let's say, explodes and you have loads of influx of downloads, because most podcasters don't really have, the retention strategy in place, the content piece to keep those listeners binging all their old catalog, because again, there's just generic topics that aren't highly targeted and specific to that listener. They love that episode, love the guest, probably loved you, but then they check your back catalog and none of your other episodes resonated. So let's say, for example, you were doing a personal development podcast and it was broad. And you did an episode all about anxiety, overcoming anxiety, right? And you interviewed someone who was an expert within the field, millions of followers. They then share that with their audience. Their audience comes, you get thousands more downloads on an episode. And then people start going through your back catalog, looking for your other episodes all about anxiety. Because remember, the topic anxiety was the thing that attracted them to your podcast in the first place, right? So go through your back catalog, but because it's generic personal development content, the next episode is all about, let's say, fitness. Then the next one is about building up, leaving your 9 to 5. Then the next one is all about, building better relationships with yourself. Then the next one's all about mindset. But they came because of anxiety. And they love your episode on anxiety. And then they check your back catalog to see if you have more episodes all about anxiety. And they found a bunch of other stuff they don't really care about. And that's what happens. You're not able to really capture that audience who've just discovered your show because you don't have the content piece, the demand-based content strategy in place to actually keep those people. So these are some issues with a typical way that people try to get exposure for their shows, right? But there's another way, and there's a much better way, right? What if instead of you constantly promoting on social media and relying on high-profile guests to grow your podcast, you simply were being shown to listeners who are actively searching for your content, the right listeners who are going onto Apple and Spotify with intention of finding a podcast like yours. If it's about anxiety, they're typing in how to reduce anxiety. How much easier would it be if you to convince those people to become a listener of your show, right? And that's exactly what podcast SEO allows you to do. Podcast SEO isn't about websites, blogs, and all this malarkey that people talk about and tags. Podcast SEO is simply the process of ranking your podcast higher on Apple and Spotify. Apple and Spotify, that is the main platforms new listeners go to discover new shows to listen to. Now, how you optimize your show for podcast SEO, I'm going to break it down in just a moment, but just know it's about adding the right keywords to your show name, your episode title, show notes, all these different areas. And that's how you start ranking. There are over 100 million listeners in America alone, and the majority of them just type in how to reduce anxiety, how to grow a podcast, how to scale up my business, Kundalini meditation. They search in particular keywords looking for specific podcasts to listen to about that topic. Now, the issue is the majority of podcasters are completely unaware, or they just ignore podcast SEO. They essentially just name the episode based on what sounds good or generic AI suggested titles, but not based on what people are actively searching for, which means they create all of this great content that can't be found by the right listeners who are high intent, who are literally begging to find a show like yours. That's like launching an amazing online course, creating the best course ever, launching it, but then setting your website on private so no one can find it. That's like, publishing a best-selling book that's beautifully written, but then leaving it in your basement and not posting it on Amazon or showing it on different marketplaces. And that's like, opening up a fancy restaurant with incredible food, but then refusing to put up a sign, a website, or listing your restaurant on Google so it can actually be found, and then being annoyed that no one's showing up to the launch. Now, I could go on for ages kind of giving different analogies, but the point here is if you're not optimizing your podcast for podcast SEO, you're severely disadvantaged because you might have the best content on planet Earth, but then you're missing out on all this free traffic that you could be getting if you just optimize your show to be found on Apple and Spotify, the main platform listeners go to discover new shows. Well, the fix is simple. Optimize your show for podcast SEO. So what we did for Ben, we did some market research and figured out the main keyword that he needed to rank for was electricians. Pretty simple. So we added this everywhere. I'm talking about his actual episode titles. I'm talking about his podcast name. We included, keywords like time management for electrician, reducing stress on electrician in his episode titles. And we added and optimized his show description and show notes to have all the relevant keywords. So the result of this was, when you type in electrician on Apple or Spotify or whatever streaming platform you're on, podcast ranks super high. It ranks on page 1. You can see this right here. He's the second result. And then on Apple, he's again the second result. Electrician podcast, electrician. Made a huge difference in terms of, again, the growth of his show. Now, instead of him constantly chasing listeners, new listeners were finding him organically through search. Now, imagine what that would do for you. Imagine having new listeners discovering your podcast pretty quickly, pretty seamlessly, because you simply optimize your show for podcast SEO. What would that be like for you? Instead of having to just chase and promote, there's a new strategy, a new way to be found by your ideal listeners who are high intent. But then, of course, there was one final step. How do we put everything on autopilot? And this is really what we call the growth flywheel, and why we built a listener community for Ben's podcast. Because the question is, once people can find your podcast, how do we make sure that they're loyal, right? And the simple answer is you create a community. Because here's the reality, your audience want consistent connection. So for Ben, we built a Facebook group because Ben already has some experience when it comes to groups and communities. So we thought, you know what, this is a great starting point. Let's use what you have to your advantage. So we thought, let's just double down in that area. But why Facebook groups specifically? Well, number one, we wanted to give his podcast more exposure. I'm going to explain how that works later on. Number two, we needed a way to convert new members into podcast listeners. And number three, we needed a way to keep his current listeners engaged in between episodes. So here's the exact steps we took for Ben to grow his community and use that to drive more listeners to his podcast. So for Ben, we posted every other day in his community to keep it engaged. We posted hyper-focused content around stress management, making more money with your podcast, and just valuable posts in general. People within the community started engaging. And of course, because he had a targeted community of electricians, the community became more engaged. Now, as the community started building up engagement, Facebook started sharing his group to what we call lookalike audiences. So Facebook started pushing out his Facebook group and recommending it to other electricians. And again, you see, because he's targeted, Facebook knows the right type of people to recommend his community and group to. Now, as Facebook started recommending his group to new members, these are all new members who didn't know of Ben before, didn't know about his podcast, and they discovered Ben's community. They joined. And every single Monday, we got Ben to make a weekly welcome post where we essentially just welcomed everyone to the group. And then he shared within a comment section his number one most popular episode to help them in their journey. So all of these new members who were joining every single week were now being exposed to Ben's brand and his podcast. And they were being recommended a fan favorite episode that they can just click and listen to. This was a simple funnel that allowed Ben to grow his online community, reach more of the right members. Those members then become exposed to his podcast and then listen to a fan favorite episode, which sold them on the show. And because we had the right strategy of the authority positioning, they actually became a listener of the podcast because it was highly targeted. Because we had the demand-based content strategy in place, it meant once they listened to one episode, they looked through his back catalog and future episodes. And because all of them were highly relevant, they kept on listening. And because it was optimized for podcast SEO, it was very easy for people to discover and find this podcast when they just search on Apple and Spotify. Now, can you see how this starts to really snowball into a flywheel? How it kind of takes on a life of its own where things just become even better? Because now he then sends his podcast listeners to his community becomes more engaged. Facebook then pushes his community, recommending it to more of the right members. More members join his community, and then he makes a post sharing about his podcast. They listen to his podcast. So you can see how this really is a flywheel where things start speeding up. And that's how he was able to have such fast growth with his podcast. So to recap, Ben for 2 years was stuck with slow and steady growth, and he couldn't break past this plateau. He was posting all the time, relying on high profile guests, but he couldn't break past 400 monthly downloads. And with just a few simple tweaks, helping him position himself as more of an authority, clarifying specifically who his show was for, and then communicating who the podcast was for through his podcast show name, his show description, his cover art, we made a show wildly attractive to the right listeners. For him, that was electricians. We then helped him build a demand-based content strategy where he covers specific topics on the show in order to keep listeners coming back for more, in order to nurture those listeners long term, because every single episode he posted was highly relevant to the pain points they were going through, and they were presented as a solution to their problems. We then optimized his show for podcast SEO. which meant he was now being found by more of the right listeners who were searching for electrician content on Apple and Spotify. This helped him grow organically and boosted his visibility. And then finally, we used Facebook as a growth mechanism in order to keep his current listeners engaged, in order to reach new listeners, and in order to convert new members of his community into active listeners of his podcast. Again, very simple changes that we made to help him go from 0 of a new show to 5,000 plus monthly downloads in just 90 days. Month 1 was 1,169. Month 2 was 2,875. Month 3 was 5,416. So look, here's my message to you. If you're an entrepreneur and expert right now who is struggling to grow despite great content, think about some of the things I've shared on this video today and think about how does it apply to your podcast. Look, every podcast is different, hence why we work with clients on a one-on-one basis, really helping them understand their blind spots for their specific show, their growth barriers, and then helping them build a unique strategy for their particular show, right? Every podcast is different. But I hope this kind of shows you that growth isn't just random. It's not going to come by throwing crap at the wall and just hoping that somehow, someday the show will magically take off. It requires you to take intentional action, very specific steps in order to drive way more growth for your podcast. And it is possible and you can do it. It's just, again, about having the right strategy, the right systems in place to take things to that next level.
Massively exciting. And it's but a lot more interesting. I'm getting into a position now with I've got too much. So I'm going to niche it down a little bit. So right, I'll concentrate on these two because you can't keep commenting to everybody and anybody. You want to sort of, fine tune exactly what we've been working on to where it's needed best. Where's going to help your podcast grow the best and where's a good place to concentrate your efforts. Obviously, the free consultation is, I think, what I've done twice before I actually jumped in. But yeah, have a consultation with them and see what you can get offered from Get More Listeners. And then if it's not for you at that time, don't write it off. Do what I did. Follow along.